It was a grand affair. One of those events that everyone in town talked about for weeks. Maybe even months. The venue was dazzling, an upscale restaurant nestled on the banks of the river, its glass windows reflecting the golden hue of the setting sun. Inside, the guests were dressed in their finest clothes, laughing, sipping champagne, and discussing everything from the latest business deals to the newest trends. Music played softly in the background, while waiters, dressed in crisp black and white uniforms, moved silently between tables, offering trays of delicacies that only the wealthiest could afford. The occasion was a celebration of Mr. David's success. Mr. David, a self-made businessman who had built his empire from the ground up, had invited the who's who of the city to join him in marking the anniversary of his company. It was not just a celebration of business achievements but of his rise from humble beginnings to a life of opulence and influence. The evening was meant to be a testament to his hard work, his tenacity, and his ability to transform adversity into opportunity. As the guests chatted among themselves, the scene in the restaurant felt almost like a scene from an extravagant movie. Golden chandeliers cast soft light on the polished marble floors, and the rich scent of fine food filled the air. The sound of clinking glasses and the low hum of conversation blended into a pleasant melody that could only be found in such a place of wealth and privilege. Everyone seemed content in their own little bubble, secure in their success, their future, and their standing in society. But then, something unexpected happened. As the laughter and music swirled around the room, a figure appeared at the door. The entrance was not grand, it wasn't marked by the fanfare of a VIP guest arriving or the sound of applause. In fact, it was quiet at first, almost unnoticed. An old man, his hair wispy and grey, his clothes ragged and stained, stood at the threshold. He held a large sack, its contents unknown, and his face was weathered, his eyes tired from a life of hardship. His shoes were worn down from years of walking, and his hands trembled slightly as he shifted his weight. For a brief moment, no one noticed him. But then the security guard, stationed by the door, saw the old man and approached him with suspicion. "Sorry, sir. You can't come in," the guard said, his tone cold and dismissive. The old man hesitated but didn't retreat. He stood his ground, his eyes scanning the room, looking not for riches, but for someone familiar. His presence, so out of place in this gleaming palace of wealth, caused a ripple of reaction among the guests. Whispers began to circulate like a wave breaking over the crowd. "Who is that old man?" one guest whispered. "What's he doing here?" "Probably some beggar looking for a handout," another said, rolling their eyes. A third guest, noticing his tattered clothes, sneered. "This is a private event, not a charity for the homeless." Despite the mockery, the old man did not flinch. His gaze remained fixed, unwavering. He wasn't looking for sympathy or charity, he was simply waiting for what he himself couldn't say. It was as if he had a purpose, a reason for being there, even though no one else could see it. The security guard, his patience running thin, moved closer. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave," he said, a little more forcefully now. But the old man wasn't ready to give up. He stood even taller, his back straighter now, his eyes locked with the guards. "I'm here to see Mr. David," he said in a voice that was surprisingly steady. Despite his frailty, "I have something important to tell him." The words hung in the air for a moment, and the guard, a little taken aback, hesitated. He had heard stories about Mr. David's success, everyone had. But who was this man, so out of place in this world of wealth and grandeur, to claim such a connection? The guard looked at the old man, then at the room behind him, unsure of what to do. Finally, he turned to a nearby waiter, motioning him over. "Go inside," the guard said to the waiter, "and tell Mr. David there's someone here to see him." As the waiter walked off to find Mr. David, the old man waited patiently, his hands clasped together. his head slightly bowed. He wasn't anxious. Nor was he afraid. It was as though he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. And now that it had arrived, he was ready. Meanwhile, the whispers among the guests grew louder. A few of them were curious, others more dismissive. But all of them were captivated by this odd and sudden interruption to the evening's festivities. Who was this man? Why had he come? What did he want with Mr. David? Of all people. But the old man, standing at the threshold of the room, gave no answers. He simply waited. In that moment, as the crowd's murmurs continued, something shifted, something that no one could yet understand. What had started as an uncomfortable disruption was beginning to feel, almost imperceptibly, like the beginning of something far more profound. And as the minutes passed, the old man, with his humble presence, seemed to become the still center of a storm that was about to unfold. As the minutes passed, a sense of unease began to settle over the room. The whispers among the guests grew louder, though none dared to approach the old man. They were too absorbed in their own world of luxury and perfection to concern themselves with someone who, to them, seemed so out of place. His weathered clothes, his trembling hands, his worn-out shoes, they all painted a picture of a life lived on the margins. He was nothing like them, and they could not understand why he would choose to step into their perfect world. But the old man was undeterred. Standing in the doorway, he remained completely still, as if time itself had frozen. His eyes, deep and dark, seemed to hold a secret that no one could quite grasp. And yet, despite the ridicule, the dismissive glances, and the murmurs from the guests, there was something about him that commanded attention. It wasn't his appearance that drew people in, but the quiet resolve in his stance, as though he knew something that everyone else had forgotten. The security guard, growing impatient with the situation, turned to the waiter. "Did you tell Mr. David about the man outside?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. The waiter, a young man with wide eyes, nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I just spoke to Mr. David. He said he would be out in a moment." The security guard let out an audible sigh, then turned back to the old man. "Sir, please," he said, trying to sound more polite. "We need to clear the entrance. I'm afraid you'll have to leave." But the old man, still standing tall, did not move. His expression remained calm, patient, almost resigned. He didn't argue, didn't shout or make a scene. He simply repeated, in the same steady voice, "I'm here to see Mr. David. I have something important to tell him." A few guests had begun to take notice, though most still looked at the old man with judgment, shaking their heads in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," one of them muttered under her breath. "What could he possibly want with Mr. David? I bet he's here to beg for money," another guest whispered, looking at the old man with a mixture of pity and disdain. "This isn't the place for that. It's a celebration, not a charity." But as the tension in the room grew, something unexpected happened. The murmurs from the guests grew softer, and a few of them began to exchange looks. Some of them had a vague sense of recognition, though they couldn't quite place it. The name David had been mentioned, and it was clear that this was no ordinary guest. The more they stared at the old man, the more a few began to realize that there was a connection here, something familiar about him. Was he someone they had known in the past? Could he be a relative? A distant friend? The uncertainty made them uneasy, and for a brief moment, they became aware of how much they had judged the man simply by his appearance. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, Mr. David appeared from within the restaurant. He stepped into the hallway, his sharp eyes immediately locking onto the figure of the old man standing in the doorway. The room went silent, and all eyes turned toward him. The guests, still whispering, watched in astonishment as Mr. David moved toward the old man with an expression that could only be described as surprise and reverence. The security guard stepped aside, allowing Mr. David to approach. As the businessman drew closer, his face softened, and a genuine warmth spread across his features. He stood before the old man, and without saying a word, extended his hand. "Mr. Thompson?" Mr. David asked, his voice filled with disbelief. The old man's eyes lit up, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, a smile appeared on his face. "David," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I knew you'd remember me." The moment hung in the air, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The guests who had been gossiping just moments before now fell silent, unsure of what was happening. But there was no mistaking the look of recognition between the two men. Mr. David, a man of wealth and influence, had clearly known the old man, and it was evident that their connection went beyond what anyone could have imagined. Mr. David's hand was still extended, and the old man reached out to take it. "I didn't expect to find you here. Not like this," Mr. David said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm glad you did." For the first time in that entire evening, the tension in the room began to ease. The guests, curious and confused, waited for an explanation. What was this unexpected reunion all about? What was the significance of this old man, so out of place in this world of wealth and sophistication? What was it that had brought him here, at this very moment, to confront the life that Mr. David had built? And as the two men stood in the doorway, the answers to these questions began to slowly unfold. One layer at a time, the grand celebration of wealth and success was about to take a dramatic turn. Little did anyone know, the real story of the night was only just beginning to reveal itself. The room was still, the air thick with curiosity and confusion. The guests, who had once been immersed in their conversations and the luxurious atmosphere, were now utterly silent, eyes fixed on the two men at the door. Mr. David, the well-dressed entrepreneur who had built his empire from the ground up, stood face to face with the old man, whose appearance seemed worlds apart from the polished setting of the celebration. The contrast was striking, yet somehow, there was an undeniable connection between them. Mr. David's hand still lingered in the air, an offering of respect and recognition. The old man, despite his frail appearance, grasped it firmly, his weathered fingers a silent testament to a lifetime of struggle and perseverance. "Mr. Thompson," Mr. David repeated, his voice softer now, full of emotion. "I didn't expect you to come here. Not like this." The old man, his eyes gleaming with a quiet wisdom, met Mr. David's gaze with a knowing smile. "David," he said, his voice low but full of warmth, "I didn't expect you to have forgotten me either." A wave of silence swept through the room. The guests who had been gossiping moments before were now lost in the unfolding drama, each one sensing that they were witnessing something far more profound than they could have imagined. "Please, come in," Mr. David said, motioning for the old man to enter the restaurant. But the old man shook his head gently, his expression calm and patient. "No," he replied, "I'm not here to interrupt your celebration. I came to speak with you, and only with you." A murmur rippled through the guests as they exchanged puzzled looks. What could this old man possibly want with a successful businessman like Mr. David? And why had he chosen to come at this very moment? The answers were not yet clear, but the intrigue was undeniable. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the old man continued, his voice steady. "I'm just here to remind you of something important that I'm afraid you might have forgotten." Mr. David, still standing at the door, looked at the old man, a mixture of emotions flickering across his face. Recognition, confusion, and a trace of guilt. "What do you mean, Mr. Thompson?" he asked softly, his brow furrowing. "What could I have possibly forgotten?" The old man glanced around the room, his gaze briefly meeting the eyes of the guests who were now watching the exchange with bated breath. But he did not waver, his attention firmly on Mr. David. 30 years ago," he began, his voice carrying the weight of years gone by. "When you were just a boy, struggling to survive in a world that seemed so indifferent to your plight. It was I who helped you. It was I who showed you the way when you were lost. The way out of the darkness. Mr. David's face froze as the old man's words sank in. His memories, long buried under the weight of success, began to stir. The once clear image of his childhood, filled with hardship and poverty, flickered in his mind. He had been young, desperate, and afraid. His mother, sick and unable to care for him, had been a constant source of worry. And then there was the old man, whom he had almost forgotten, who had appeared out of nowhere to offer a helping hand. You helped my family?" Mr. David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man nodded. "I gave what little I had. Not because I expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. I helped your mother get the medicine she needed. I taught you that even in the darkest of times, kindness could light the way." Mr. David's breath caught in his throat. And for a brief moment, the powerful businessman seemed small, vulnerable. His success, his wealth, his accomplishments, all of it felt distant now, overshadowed by the flood of memories rushing back. The kindness of this old man, whose name he had nearly forgotten, had once been the beacon that had saved his family. "I remember," Mr. David whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I remember you now. You were there when no one else was." The old man smiled, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "It wasn't much, but it was enough to make a difference. You never forgot what I taught you, David. That's why you've come so far. But now, I need you to remember something else." Mr. David looked at him, confusion still clouding his face. "What do you mean?" The old man's eyes softened as he looked around the room. "You've built an empire, David. You've risen to the top. But don't forget that what truly matters isn't the money or the power, it's the people you help along the way. The kindness you show, the love you give. That's the legacy you leave behind. Not the buildings or the bank accounts." The words hung in the air, a powerful reminder of the values that had guided David when he was just a boy with nothing but hope and determination. He had spent his life chasing success. But now, as the old man's words sank in, he realized that there was more to life than the relentless pursuit of wealth. As the old man finished speaking, the room was silent. The guests, who had once judged him for his appearance, now watched with awe and a sense of shame. What had seemed so trivial moments ago, this man, standing in the doorway with his tattered clothes and humble demeanor, was now the bearer of a profound truth. And in that moment, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. It was as if the walls had come down, and everyone could see, clearly and plainly, what really mattered. The silence in the room was almost suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were fixed on the scene unfolding before them. The story of an old man and a successful businessman who, in an instant, had been transported back to a moment in time that neither could forget. For a long while, Mr. David stood there, the weight of the old man's words settling into his chest like an anchor. He could feel the eyes of the guests burning into his back. But it was as though they no longer mattered. He looked at the old man standing before him, his figure small yet somehow towering in significance. This was the man who had saved his family, the man whose kindness had altered the course of his life. "I don't understand," Mr. David finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "How could I have forgotten? I should have done more for you. I should have." He trailed off, the words not coming easily. 1,000 thoughts swirled in his mind, but none of them made sense in the context of the years that had passed. The old man's eyes softened, and he placed a hand on Mr. David's shoulder. "It's not about what you should have done, David. It's about what you're going to do now." His voice was steady, full of warmth, yet there was a quiet sorrow in his gaze. "You've made your fortune. You've done well for yourself. And I'm proud of you. But don't lose sight of what matters most." Mr. David swallowed hard, trying to keep his emotions in check. I don't want to lose sight of it. I don't. I just got so caught up in everything. His voice faltered. The burden of his success now feeling heavy. Like a mask he had worn for too long. I forgot the things that mattered when I was younger. I got so caught up in building something that I lost myself along the way. The old man nodded. His expression one of understanding. It happens to many. We get caught up in the chase for wealth, status, recognition. But in the end, none of that will matter if we've forgotten the people who helped us along the way. Mr. David looked around the room, his eyes scanning the guests who had once been so eager to dismiss the old man. Now, they were silent, their faces filled with a mixture of guilt and realization. Perhaps they, too, were reflecting on their own lives, the choices they had made, and the people they had overlooked or dismissed along the way. The old man continued, his voice a soft, yet powerful reminder. True success is measured not by what you have, but by what you give. Not by the buildings you own or the money you make, but by the lives you touch, the kindness you show, and the love you share. Mr. David closed his eyes for a moment, letting the old man's words wash over him. His life had been one of ambition, of striving for more and more, as if success could fill the emptiness he sometimes felt inside. But now, standing before this man, he understood that true fulfillment came not from achievements or accolades, but from giving back, from remembering where he came from, and most importantly, from never forgetting the kindness that had once saved him. The guests in the room shifted uncomfortably, some beginning to look at one another with new awareness. The opulence of the surroundings, the gleaming chandeliers, the polished silverware, the expensive wine suddenly seemed insignificant. The old man's presence, with his worn clothes and humble demeanor, had brought into stark relief what they had all forgotten, the value of compassion, humility, and love. Mr. David turned back to the old man, his heart filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, the words inadequate for what he truly felt. "Thank you for reminding me." The old man smiled, his eyes twinkling with something akin to pride. "I didn't come here to remind you of your past, David. I came here to remind you of your future. You've done well, but there's always more you can do. There's always room to grow, to give, to love." The room remained still for a long moment. And then, slowly, the guests began to stir, their whispers now not of mockery, but of reflection. One by one, they began to approach Mr. David and the old man, each person silently acknowledging the truth of the lesson they had just heard. Some faces were reddened with shame, others with realization, but all of them seemed to understand something now that they had not before, that in the end, kindness was the measure of true success. The old man, his task now complete, gave a small nod of approval before turning to leave. "Remember, David," he said softly, "it's not too late. Never forget the power of a kind heart." With that, the old man slowly made his way out the door, disappearing into the quiet night. But his presence lingered, like a gentle reminder, a whisper in the air that would forever change the lives of everyone in that room. As the door closed behind him, the guests remained in thoughtful silence. There was no applause, no grand gesture to mark the end of the evening. Instead, there was a shared understanding, a quiet transformation that had taken place within each person present. And as Mr. David stood there, his heart now lighter, he knew that his life would never be the same, not because of the wealth he had accumulated or the empire he had built, but because of the lesson he had learned from the simplest of men, the lesson of kindness. As the old man disappeared into the night, the room remained unusually quiet. The hum of conversation had stilled, and there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The lavish banquet hall, which had once felt like a place of prestige and opulence, now seemed less important. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some looking down, others exchanging knowing glances. The night that had begun with laughter and clinking glasses was now filled with a deep, Collective silence. A silence that spoke volumes. David stood in the center of the room, his eyes slowly scanning the faces of the guests. His mind was still trying to process everything: the old man's appearance, his words, the years that had passed since their last encounter. It was as if the very foundation of everything he had built was being questioned. And yet, despite the unease creeping into his chest, he felt something else, a quiet sense of clarity. Like the fog had lifted, allowing him to see life more clearly than he had in years. One by one, guests began to approach him, each with a different look in their eyes. Some seemed embarrassed. Others were more reflective. A few had their heads lowered, as though they were ashamed. But all of them were noticeably different from the people who had walked into the banquet just a few hours ago. They had all witnessed something that, even though subtle, was deeply transformative. David's old friend, Robert, a successful investor who had always prided himself on his sharp wit and business acumen, was the first to speak. "David," he said, his voice low and hesitant. I don't know what to say. I didn't think about it that way before. I've always believed that success was just about building wealth, about being at the top. But that man," he trailed off, his voice cracking slightly. "He's right, isn't he? It's not about the money, is it?" David nodded slowly, his own words catching in his throat. "No, it's not. It never was. I've spent so many years thinking that success was about accumulating more and more, building an empire. But I never stopped to think about the people who helped me get here, about the kindness I received along the way. And I forgot to pass that on." Robert looked down, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his glass. "I've been so focused on my own career," he said quietly. "So focused on staying ahead, staying on top. I forgot the people who mattered. I forgot to help those who needed it. Just like that old man helped you." David placed a hand on Robert's shoulder. "We've all been guilty of that," he said softly. "It's easy to get caught up in the pursuit of success. But at the end of the day, it's the relationships we build and the kindness we show that truly define us." Slowly, others began to join the conversation. Each person who spoke seemed to feel the weight of the moment. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic declarations. Instead, there was a quiet, introspective understanding shared between them. They all knew that something had changed, that they had all been given an unexpected gift that night, not just by the old man, but by the realization that true success lay not in wealth, but in character, compassion, and generosity. As the evening wore on, David noticed the way the guests were interacting with one another. The usual competitiveness, the subtle games of one-upmanship, had disappeared. In its place was a newfound sense of camaraderie, a shared sense of humility. People were no longer concerned with impressing each other. Instead, they were listening, truly listening, to one another. Some even began to discuss how they could give back to their communities, how they could make a real difference in the lives of others. David's heart felt lighter as he observed the change in the room. It was as though the old man's visit had broken down the walls that had separated them all, walls built by ego, status, and self-interest. In its place was a quiet unity, an understanding that they were all connected, that they all had a responsibility to lift one another up. By the time the evening came to a close, David felt a deep sense of peace. The night had started in one way, filled with the superficial trappings of wealth and success. But it had ended with something much more profound. It had ended with the realization that true fulfillment in life comes not from what you accumulate, but from what you give. It was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the last guests filtered out of the hall, David stood alone for a moment, looking around the room. The empty chairs, the discarded napkins, the leftover champagne glasses, all of it seemed unimportant now. What mattered were the lessons that had been learned, the hearts that had been touched, and the lives that had been changed. He thought of the old man, who had left as quietly as he had arrived, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you," David whispered into the quiet room, as if speaking directly to the man who had given him so much more than he could ever repay. And with that, the night came to a close, leaving behind a lasting impression that would ripple through each life present, touching them in ways they could never have imagined. As the last of the guests left the banquet hall, the night air seemed to carry the weight of something more than just the passing of time. The once vibrant gathering had been reduced to quiet whispers and gentle farewells. But the lessons learned would echo long after. The glimmer of the evening's lavishness faded, replaced by a deep sense of introspection that hung in the air like a quiet promise. The evening had begun with a celebration of wealth, success, and power, but it had ended with something far more lasting, a reawakening of humanity. David sat alone for a while in the empty hall, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. He could still feel the old man's presence, as if his words had rooted themselves deep inside his heart. It was as if, in just a few minutes, his entire life had been redefined. For years, David had chased after prestige, believing that the accumulation of wealth and status would bring him happiness. But now, he truly knew that what mattered most was the impact he had on the lives of others. He thought back to his younger self, when he had struggled to make ends meet, when he had received a hand up from others who had chosen kindness over indifference. In that moment, David understood that the true measure of success was not in how much one had gained, but in how much one had given. It was a lesson that, despite its simplicity, was often the hardest to learn. "I'll do better," David murmured to himself. A vow he knew he would keep. He wouldn't just be a success in business anymore, he would strive to be a success in life. In the ways that truly mattered. He would take this lesson with him, not just for a day or a week, but for the rest of his life. From that moment on, his pursuit of success would be inseparable from his pursuit of kindness, generosity, and genuine connection. Outside the hall, the guests who had stayed behind in the garden shared quiet, reflective conversations. Robert, the businessman who had been the first to speak with David, found himself walking slowly toward his car. His mind raced with the weight of the evening's events, the old man's face still clear in his memory. Robert had always prided himself on being sharp, calculating, a master of strategy. Success to him had always been about outsmarting others, staying one step ahead. But now, as he walked beneath the dim light of the street lamps, something in him had shifted. He realized that the years spent climbing the corporate ladder had also meant years spent ignoring the people who truly needed him. How many opportunities had he passed by to help someone, to offer a hand instead of a handshake? How many moments had he let slip by, believing that success would eventually fill the emptiness inside him? Now, as he stood in the cool night air, Robert understood that the true value of his success was not measured by his bank account, but by the lives he touched. He realized that no amount of wealth or status would fill the void of a life lived without purpose, without connection to others. He made a silent promise to himself: he would change. He would spend more time with his family, offer his resources to help those in need, and strive to be a man of integrity not just in business, but in all aspects of life. Elsewhere, Laura, a successful but solitary lawyer who had often found solace in her career, sat in her car, the engine running. She had been a quiet observer of the evening's events, a woman who had always placed her career above all else, convinced that success and independence were the only things worth chasing. But as she reflected on the old man's words, a deep sadness washed over her. She had spent so many years focused on climbing the ladder, and in doing so, she had distanced herself from the people who had once mattered to her most: her family, her friends, her community. In that moment, Laura understood the truth: success without relationships, without love, was hollow. The career that had once defined her now felt like an empty shell, a reflection of a life that had lacked depth. She resolved that she would reconnect with the people she had pushed away, that she would nurture her relationships and invest in the bonds that truly mattered. Her definition of success would no longer be confined to professional accolades. She would strive to be known for her kindness, her loyalty, and her ability to love. And then there was Andrew, a young tech entrepreneur who had always been dazzled by the allure of wealth and fame. Andrew had built his startup from the ground up, and to his surprise, he had found himself standing at the top. Yet, despite his success, he often felt an emptiness that no amount of money could fill. That emptiness had become a quiet companion, one he had tried to ignore, but it had always lingered in the background. Now, as he drove away from the event, Andrew reflected on the evening's lessons. The old man had reminded him of something he had forgotten, that true fulfillment didn't come from acquisitions or accomplishments, but from giving to others, giving to the community, giving without expecting anything in return. In his pursuit of success, Andrew had lost sight of what truly mattered. But now, he had a new purpose: to use his position not just for personal gain, but for the benefit of others. He would find ways to give back, to contribute, and to be a source of support for those who needed it most. As the city lights blurred past, Andrew realized that he no longer wanted to be known as just another successful entrepreneur. He wanted to be known as someone who made a difference, someone whose wealth and success had a positive impact on the world around him. The story of that night, the old man's visit, his unwavering kindness, and his powerful lesson would remain with them all for a lifetime. Each guest left with a different lesson, but they all shared one thing in common: they had been awakened to the true meaning of success. It was not about what you had, but about what you gave. It was not about how high you climbed, but about the people you lifted along the way. The most valuable thing in life was not wealth or status, but the way you treated others, the kindness you shared, and the love you gave freely. And as each of them carried that lesson forward, the ripple effect began. They would change, and the world would change with them. And in the end, that was the true legacy of the old man, a legacy of kindness, humility, and the profound impact that one person could have on the lives of many.